I never thought I'd be back here. Standing in the doorway of my grandmother's house, clutching the set of tarnished keys she'd left me in her will, I felt the weight of everything all at once. The grief, the memories, the sheer strangeness of being alone in a house that had always felt so full of life. The place hadn't changed much since I was a child. Still, isolated, on the edge of town, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to bend and whisper in the wind. The house loomed before me, its chipped paint and ivy-covered walls giving it a timeless, almost haunting appearance. I remember loving this place as a kid, even though it had always given me a strange feeling. Now, as an adult, that feeling was magnified. It wasn't just the sadness of losing my grandmother, it was something else. I stepped inside, and the air hit me immediately, stale and thick, like it had been holding its breath since the last time someone truly lived here. The entryway creaked under my boots, the sound echoing through the quiet empty space. Dust coated nearly everything. Most of the furniture was covered in white sheets, like ghosts standing still in the dim light filtering through the dirty windows. There was a heaviness in the air, an oppressive atmosphere that made me pause as I took in the familiar space. "It's just the memories," I whispered to myself, trying to shake the unease. Grief does funny things to people, and I figured that's all this was, a combination of nostalgia and the weight of loss. The first night was hard. Settling into a house like this, with its long dark hallways and unfamiliar silence, was harder than I expected. Every sound felt amplified, the groan of the old wood beneath my feet, the whisper of the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. It was an old house. Old houses make noise, I told myself. Still, I couldn't help but feel like the house was watching me. It was an absurd thought, but I couldn't shake it. I unpacked the essentials, made myself some tea, and wandered through the house, reacquainting myself with the place. The furniture was mostly as I remembered it, dark wood, heavy and imposing. A few faded photographs hung on the walls, including one of my grandmother and grandfather on their wedding day. My grandmother's smile was radiant, but my grandfather's expression was harder to read. I barely remembered him. He died before I was born, and my grandmother never talked much about him. Later that evening, as I was unpacking in the living room, I caught it, just for a moment. A flicker of movement from the corner of my eye. I turned my head sharply toward the staircase, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows cast by the dim light of the setting sun. Beneath the stairs, the shadows were deeper, darker than they should have been. I stared at the space for a moment, my heart picking up speed. It felt like there was something there, but when I focused on it, the feeling disappeared. "It's nothing," I said out loud, my voice breaking the silence. "Just tired." But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling. The shadow under the stairs lingered in my mind, growing heavier with every passing hour. Even as I climbed into bed and closed my eyes, the image of that dark, too still space stayed with me. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, this was my grandmother's house. It was filled with memories and shadows, nothing more. At least that's what I wanted to believe. The days dragged on like this, quiet, heavy, and filled with the persistent sense that I was not alone. The house was unchanged, yet it felt increasingly foreign to me with every passing hour. The shadows beneath the stairs were no longer just shadows. They had a life of their own now, creeping into my peripheral vision when I least expected it. No matter how much I tried to focus on other things, I couldn't escape the growing unease in my chest. I couldn't stop looking at that dark corner. The shadow seemed to stretch longer each day, like it was waiting, watching. The air around it felt colder, and sometimes, just as I turned my head away, I could have sworn I heard something, soft, barely audible whispers. They came and went so quickly that I wasn't sure if I had imagined them. The wind, maybe, the house creaking, but still a part of me knew that there was something in that darkness, something waiting. I told myself it was just the house. The quiet, the isolation, it had to be making me paranoid. Maybe it was my grief, my loneliness. I hadn't been here in years, and now I was suddenly surrounded by all of these old memories. The old journals I had found tucked away in my grandmother's attic weren't helping much either. I had been slowly sifting through them, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain who she was, before the role of grandmother was all she ever seemed to be. Her handwriting was familiar, a curling script that reminded me of the notes she would leave on the kitchen table when I was a child. But as I flipped through the pages, I found myself immersed in something darker than I expected. At first, the entries spoke of her love for my grandfather. She had written about how they met, their courtship, the dreams they shared. But as I read on, the words began to shift, the tone growing more strained. There was a clear sense of dread in some of the later entries. She mentioned my grandfather's temper more than once, describing arguments that were becoming harder to brush off. She wrote about sleepless nights, his cold silences, the weight of his presence in the house. His moods had become unpredictable, she said, and it was as if she were always waiting for the storm to break. And then there were the strange passages, the ones that spoke of feeling trapped, of no escape.
I don't know what to do anymore. He's not the man I married. He's someone else entirely now, and I'm afraid of what he's capable of.
I found myself staring at those words for far too long, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It wasn't that I hadn't heard the stories of my grandfather's temper before, but reading these accounts, his temper, his growing aggression, somehow felt more real, more urgent, in my grandmother's own words. It was like she was pleading for someone to hear her, to understand. But the most unsettling part came one evening, when I stumbled upon a single note tucked into the back of one of her journals. It wasn't written on a page, but instead on a small scrap of paper. The handwriting was the same, though the words were short, cryptic.
I had no choice.
The ink was smudged slightly, as though she had written it in a hurry. The simplicity of it struck me with a chill that I couldn't ignore. What had she meant by that? I turned the note over, hoping to find something more, some explanation, but there was nothing. Just the words. No context. The note felt like a bomb, ticking away in the back of my mind. It unsettled me more than anything else I had read. My grandmother had written this, and it was clear that whatever she was referring to, it had weighed on her, haunted her. I couldn't shake the feeling that the answer, whatever it was somehow tied to the shadow beneath the stairs. It was as though the house itself had begun to grow heavy with the burden of its history, and the longer I stayed here, the more I could feel the past pressing down on me. I would catch glimpses of the shadow again, each time more distinct than before. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination, it was real. And it was waiting. Something told me that the truth, the whole truth, lay buried in this house, and I was afraid of what I might find. The house was changing. Or maybe it wasn't the house itself, but something in the air, something in me that had shifted. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong, that the weight pressing down on me wasn't just the grief I'd brought with me, or the silence of a house that had been empty for far too long. The shadow under the stairs grew more pronounced with each passing night. It was no longer just a dark corner where the light didn't quite reach. It seemed to stretch, as if it were a living thing, expanding across the floor. And each time I looked away, no matter how quickly, I could feel it there, waiting. I tried to ignore it, but the sensation of being watched grew harder to deny. At night, the air in the house would grow heavier, thicker, and I'd find myself listening, waiting, because I could hear things now. Footsteps, soft, uneven footsteps, like someone pacing. But there was no one there. And yet, I could feel the pressure of those steps as if someone were right behind me, hovering in the shadows. But it wasn't just the footsteps, it was the whispers. The soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the dark space beneath the stairs. At first, I thought it was the wind, or perhaps the house settling. But the more I heard it, the more it felt intentional. And worse, it started to call my name.
Claire.
It was barely audible, like a breath, but it was unmistakable. Every time I heard it, my skin would prickle, a cold chill spreading down my spine. I would rush to the stairs, but when I looked, there was nothing there. One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the old bookshelf in the study. I wasn't sure why I was drawn to it, but my fingers ran along the spines of the old books, their leather covers cracked and worn. Something about the dim light in the room and the heavy quiet made me feel as though I had been here before, though I knew I hadn't. That was when I found it. A box tucked behind a row of dusty books. A box that had never been there before. or had it? My hands trembled slightly as I pulled it out. It was small, unmarked, and clearly old. Inside were a few more journals, but also something else. A yellowed newspaper clipping, folded neatly at the bottom of the box. The headline jumped out at me. Local man dies suddenly of heart attack. It was about my grandfather. I took the article in my hands, my heart pounding in my chest. I had heard stories of his death, of course. He had passed away years before I was born, and my grandmother had always told me it was a heart attack. There was nothing unusual about it. But this article... As I read the piece, a few things stood out to me. The report mentioned the heart attack, yes, but it also described his unusual behavior in the days leading up to his death. He had been acting erratically, the article said. Mood swings, sudden outbursts, and a strange, restless energy that made his family uncomfortable. It didn't make sense. Why had no one ever talked about this before? Why had my grandmother kept this from me? The article also mentioned something else. Something that made my stomach turn. It described a strange detail about his condition at the time of death. A note was made in the report that there had been no sign of any struggle or physical trauma. It was almost as if he had simply collapsed, but the mention of his unpredictable temper lingered in the back of my mind. I sat down in the chair, feeling the weight of the article in my hands. I stared at the words, my mind racing. What if my grandmother had been hiding something? What if the heart attack wasn't the full story? What if there was more to his death? A memory surfaced, faint but unmistakable. A sound I hadn't thought about in years. I was a child, barely 10, but I remember walking through the hall late one evening and hearing my grandmother and grandfather arguing in the next room. Their voices were muffled, but I could make out the anger in their tones. It was a conversation I didn't fully understand at the time. I hadn't thought about it in years, but now as the memory resurfaced, I realized something I hadn't before. The argument hadn't sounded like a typical disagreement. It wasn't the kind of bickering you'd expect from a married couple. There was something different about it. Something desperate. My grandmother's voice had wavered, almost pleading, while my grandfather's was cold, threatening.
I'm afraid of what he'll do.
I had never understood what they were talking about. But now it made sense. The shadow beneath the stairs, the whispers calling my name, the growing dread I couldn't shake, it all connected. My grandfather hadn't died peacefully. My grandmother had hidden the truth. Something had happened in this house, something terrible, and it was still here, lingering in the darkness. The shadow wasn't just a shadow, it was something more. It was a part of the past that hadn't been buried. Something that had been ignored, hidden, swept under the rug, and now it was waiting. I woke up in the dead of night to a sensation that gripped my chest with icy fingers. The kind of feeling you get when you know something's wrong, even before you open your eyes. It wasn't the silence or the cold air creeping through the cracks in the window. It was something deeper. I couldn't breathe for a moment, frozen beneath the weight of it. Then, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness of my room, I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a shape in the corner of my vision. But when I focused, when I let my gaze fall toward the stairs, I knew it was there. The shadow beneath the stairs was different. This time, it wasn't just a dark corner, stretching in the shape of something unseen. No, it had form. It was as though it had solidified, become more tangible, taking the shape of a figure sitting in the darkness, hunched, unmoving. I could make out the faint outline of broad shoulders, an arm resting across a knee. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't look away. Something in me told me this wasn't just a trick of the light, not just my mind playing tricks. This shadow had substance, and then it moved. For a split second, it was as if the figure was breathing, shifting in the shadows. I felt my stomach drop as I stared at it, unable to move. My legs were frozen to the bed, my body paralyzed by an instinctual fear that crawled under my skin. But then the figure shifted again, and I saw something I wasn't ready for. For just a moment, I could make out a face, or what should have been a face. But it was obscured by the darkness, just a blur of shadows where the features should have been. A man. No doubt. A man who seemed too familiar, too much a part of the past for me to deny. My heart slammed against my ribcage, and the voice I had heard before, The whispers, the ones calling my name, grew louder.
Claire.
It was him, the shadow, the figure of a man sitting there, waiting. And now it spoke her name, not with a rasp, like it had been waiting, struggling for so long that the words came out raw, forced. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, but I had to know. I had to confront it. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, stepping lightly onto the cold wooden floor. I barely made a sound as I moved toward the stairs, though every nerve in my body screamed for me to turn around, to flee. But I couldn't. I had to understand what was happening, what this thing was, why it was here, waiting in the dark. The closer I got, the more tangible the presence became. It was as though the shadow was pulling at me, drawing me closer, like a magnet. The figure in the darkness shifted again, and I saw the shape more clearly, a man, hunched over, his shoulders broad and powerful. Then it spoke again, and this time the voice was different, clearer.
She killed me, Claire.
My blood ran cold, and for a moment I couldn't comprehend what I was hearing. The words hung in the air, so raw, so full of pain, that it felt like the walls themselves were trembling. I blinked, unable to process it. But I knew. Deep down, in some part of me I hadn't been willing to face, the figure in front of me wasn't just a shadow. It was him. The man in the dark was my grandfather. The one I had never met, the one whose death had been swept under the rug. And now, here he was, sitting beneath the stairs, a part of the house, a part of the family's dark past, whispering of something I had never wanted to know. My breath hitched as I stepped closer, my voice trembling. "Grandfather?" I whispered, the word feeling strange, foreign on my tongue. The figure didn't move, but the energy around it seemed to pulse with an undeniable force. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as the shadow inched closer to me, and I felt the cold, damp weight of his presence wrap around me. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape, to scream, to call out for help. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, my feet rooted to the spot, and all I could do was watch as the shadow flickered and shifted, the edges of his form distorting like smoke. And then the voice came again, though it was no longer a whisper.
She killed me, Claire.
The words were sharp, pained, desperate. They cut through me like a knife. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as the truth began to unfurl in front of me. This wasn't just a shadow. This wasn't just a trick of the light, or my grief twisting my mind. The shadow that had been lurking in the corners of the house, the one that had called my name, was my grandfather's spirit. Trapped. Lost. And as I stared at it, I realized with a sickening certainty that it wasn't just his death that had kept him here. It was her. My grandmother. She had done something. Something terrible. Something that had bound his spirit to this house. And now he was trapped beneath the stairs, waiting for someone, me, to uncover the truth. The weight of it pressed down on me, crushing the air from my lungs. The shadow was no longer just a shape in the dark. It was the past, reaching out from the shadows, demanding to be heard, and the truth it carried was far darker than I could have ever imagined. I couldn't leave it alone. The shadow, he was in my head, tormenting me, and I couldn't escape it. The truth that had started to unravel, that whisper in the dark, now felt like it was consuming me. But I needed to know. I needed to understand what had happened, what was still happening in this house. The journals, my grandmother's journals, were scattered across the study floor. I'd read them over and over, each entry more suffocating than the last. But I couldn't stop. They were pieces of a puzzle I needed to put together. There had to be more. Something that could explain why the house felt the way it did, why the shadows never quite left. That night, I found another journal. It was buried under the others, worn and weathered like all the rest, but it was different. It felt heavier somehow, and when I opened it, I immediately knew that this entry, this one, would be the one that would break me. The handwriting trembled, as though the words had been forced out in a flood of panic. It began like many of the others, with a description of her daily life, her concerns, but as I read on, the tone shifted. Her grandfather's temper, his unpredictable rages, the violent outbursts. The entries became more frantic, more desperate, as if she was writing to no one in particular, a cry for help that had never been answered. One entry stopped me cold.
I couldn't stop him. He came at me again tonight. He's gone too far. I don't know how much more I can take. It's too much. He's too strong, and I'm too afraid of what he'll do. I never wanted it to come to this.
I turned the page with trembling hands, my heart pounding in my chest.
I had to do it. I never wanted to kill him. But he forced me. He forced me into a corner, and there was no way out. I stabbed him in the kitchen. I didn't mean to.
The words blurred as tears welled up in my eyes. I couldn't breathe. My fingers trembled as I reached for the next page, desperate to know more. The truth was right there.
I couldn't tell anyone. He was so much stronger than me, and no one would believe me. I had to lie. I had to say it was a heart attack. I couldn't let anyone know what happened. He was gone, and I thought it was over. But the guilt, it haunts me. It won't leave me. It won't leave us.
My grandmother had killed him, and she had hidden it all, fabricated a story about a heart attack, covered up the truth, buried it deep, into the floorboards of this house, into the shadows that still lived here. And now, her secret had returned. I could feel the weight of it, crushing me, as if the house itself was pressing against my chest. The shadow, the figure of my grandfather, had been trapped, bound to the place of his death by her lie, her fear, his torment. And now, he was here. Still here. I couldn't stop the shiver that ran through me as I looked toward the stairs. The shadow wasn't just watching me now. It was reacting to me. It wasn't just a flicker in the corner of my vision. It was alive in a way that sent terror straight to my bones. I stepped toward it, my body moving of its own accord, and the shadow stretched, twisting, reaching out as if it recognized me, or wanted something from me. It didn't speak, but I could hear its voice in my mind.
Help me.
The words weren't audible, but they rang clear. My grandfather's spirit was trapped here, bound to the house by his own violent death and my grandmother's secret. He had been twisted, tortured, and now he was stuck, unable to move on, unable to find peace. I could feel it in the air, a kind of desperation. The shadow, once just a dark shape, now had a presence, something powerful, almost suffocating. It writhed, disturbed by my presence, and it felt frantic, a desperate plea for release. I backed away, stumbling as I turned to face the stairs, unable to look at it any longer. But the shadow followed me. It hovered at the edge of my vision, always just out of reach, its form stretching farther, larger, more defined. It was becoming real. I realized, with a jolt, that the house itself was cursed. This place, this house, was alive with the violence that had occurred here. It had absorbed the bloodshed, the lies, and the guilt, and now it was feeding on them. The shadow under the stairs wasn't just a lingering spirit. It was a manifestation of all the pain and suffering that had taken place in this home. The anger of my grandfather, the terror of my grandmother, the unresolved, unspoken truth. The house had never let it go. I could feel the weight of the curse now, pressing down on me, wrapping its cold fingers around my throat. I was trapped, just like the shadow, just like my grandfather. The truth had come too late, and now I was part of it. My grandfather's spirit wasn't going to rest until he was freed, until his death was known, until my grandmother's secret was revealed. And as the shadow writhed and twisted in front of me, I knew I was the only one who could set him free. But I wasn't sure if I was ready to face the full truth, because if I did, if I uncovered everything, I didn't know what would happen next. The weight of the decision crushed me. I had always thought that knowledge, the truth, was a light that would guide you, but all I felt now was the suffocating darkness of what I had uncovered. My grandfather's spirit, the shadow under the stairs, was begging for release, for justice, but justice meant tearing apart the only family history I had ever known. The shadow wasn't just waiting anymore. It was angry. The air in the house had thickened, like a storm was brewing just beneath the surface, and every step I took seemed to draw me deeper into its grasp. It had become violent, its movements jerky and erratic, like a trapped animal clawing at the walls for freedom. Every time I passed the stairs, I could feel its presence, that pull, drawing me closer. It wasn't just there to haunt me anymore, it was demanding something. Demanding the truth.
Tell them what she did.
The words came with a force now, the voice rasping in my head, seeping into my thoughts, pulling at my sanity. I felt it in my bones. The shadow, my grandfather, was angry, desperate for release. He wanted me to expose the truth. He wanted the world to know what had happened here, to know that my grandmother had killed him. I was trembling. Every part of me screamed in denial. How could I do it? How could I destroy the memory of the woman who had raised me, the one I had loved, despite everything? She was gone. And yet, she was the one who had brought this terror to life. The guilt weighed heavier with every passing moment, and I wondered how much of her love had been poisoned by the secret she had kept for so many years. But as I stood there, my eyes fixed on the shadow that flickered in the dim light of the hall, I realized that there was no other choice. My grandfather was here. His spirit was trapped by the crime my grandmother had committed and by the lies she had told to cover it all up. As long as I stayed silent, the shadow would never leave. The house would never be free from its curse. I had to speak. I had to break the silence that had lingered for so long. But how? How could I confront a legacy so dark, so filled with regret and fear? How could I face the world with the truth that could destroy everything? The shadow loomed larger, stretching across the stairs like a darkened silhouette. It was suffocating now, almost tangible, reaching out to me. I knew what it wanted. It wasn't just justice, it was peace. But to give him that peace, I had to face the one person who had built my life on lies, whose memory had been painted in softness and love, when underneath it was all built on blood and fear. I stepped forward, my legs shaking, and for the first time, I spoke aloud, my voice cracking in the silent house. She killed you. My grandmother killed you. The words felt like a weight lifted from my shoulders, but also like something had been torn open inside me. There was no going back now. The truth was out, hanging in the air like a thunderstorm ready to strike. I felt the house tremble beneath my feet, as if the walls themselves were reacting to the words, to the injustice that had been buried here for so long. And then the shadow? It shifted. It wasn't the same angry mass of darkness anymore. No longer was it a figure clawing to reach me, to force me into revealing the truth. As I stood there, my breath shallow, the air growing thick with energy, the shadow began to dissolve. Slowly at first, its form beginning to flicker like a dying flame. But as I watched, it unraveled, melting away into nothingness, the oppressive weight lifting from my chest.
Thank you.
The voice came again, this time soft and distant, like a whisper in the wind. It was calm, at peace. The shadow's presence had been erased, its torment had been broken. I stood frozen for a moment, unable to move, unable to comprehend the sudden silence that filled the house. The air was lighter now, the heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had clung to every room now dissipating like fog. I took a deep breath, the weight on my chest finally lifting, and I felt the house breathe with me. It was over. The curse was broken. The shadow was gone, leaving only the memories behind. And I knew, in some deep, aching part of myself, that my grandfather was finally at peace. The house felt different. It was as if a door had opened, and for the first time in years, the light of truth had flooded in. No longer would the silence be broken only by whispers of the past. Now the house was free. The past had been revealed. And so, too, had the future. I turned and left the stairs behind me, my heart finally calm for the first time since I had entered this house. The walls still held memories of both love and violence, but now, those memories could be laid to rest. It was time to move on, to leave the shadows where they belonged, in the past.